Hello, welcome to On Africa with me, Jean-Emile Jameen, taking you through all the latest news, making stories across the continent. Coming up on the show, DR Congo President Felix Tshisekedi says he's open to a third term, triggering opposition accusations that he's prepared to bypass constitutional limits and cling to power. He also warns ongoing fighting in the east involving AFC M23 rebels could delay the 2028 elections, raising fears of renewed political turmoil. Meanwhile, tensions rise again in Ethiopia's Tigray region as the TPLF reasserts control, defying the federal government. It restores its legislative council and appoints a new regional president, creating rival administrations. A reported fighter jet over the capital, meanwhile, heightens fears of renewed instability. And in Senegal's coastal city of Mbour, children are paying the hidden price of irregular migration. Many lost parents who disappeared at sea trying to reach Europe. Aid workers say that the silence surrounding the deaths leaves families trapped in invisible grief and children struggling to heal. Welcome to the show. Before we move to other stories, just some information coming out of Mali. At least 30 people have been killed in twin attacks in central villages claimed by Jenim militants. Local sources say that the simultaneous attacks on Korikori and Gomosogu left communities devastated, with homes looted and set on fire. Security sources say that the violence is linked to retaliatory strikes involving ethnic Dogon self-defense militia Nan Amasagu. Moving on, Congo is facing fresh political tension after President Felix Tshisekedi said he is open to a third term, sparking opposition accusations of a bid to cling to power. The remarks come as he also warned that ongoing fighting in the east of the DR Congo could delay the 2028 elections. As for the opposition, they say that any constitutional change risks renewed instability, recalling past crises triggered by election delays. It comes as the country's east remains gripped by conflict involving AFC and M23 rebels as mediation efforts struggle to hold. Emmett Livingston has this report.
Opposition leaders in the Democratic Republic of Congo on Thursday sounded the alarm about the severe dangers facing the country's fragile democracy. The day before, President Felix Tshisekedi said he would seek another presidential term if the Congolese people desire it. The president is in his second and final term under the current rules, and staying in power beyond 2028 would require a constitutional change via referendum. Across Africa, fiddling with constitutions is a tried and tested method for leaders to remain in power. Unsurprisingly, in Congo, the opposition is dead set against this possibility.
Up until
now, the president has been hiding behind his supporters. But today, the mask has effectively fallen because now he's openly campaigning for a third term through a referendum. What's shocking about this is that, as head of state, he has a duty to uphold the constitution. But instead, he's exploiting the suffering of our people to secure his hold on power. We in the opposition call on all Democrats from civil society as well as the majority itself, where there are people whispering in the background or who are against this plan, to come together to block Mr. Tshisekedi's move.
Some major opposition leaders haven't spoken yet, but others have warned that the country could plunge into crisis and have urged people to resist the move. Congo is already highly unstable, with M23 rebels backed by Rwanda occupying huge swathes of the country's east. It's not clear how the government would organise a constitutional referendum with so much territory outside of government control.
Tensions are rising again in Ethiopia's Tigray region as the Tigray People's Liberation Front, or TPLF, has moved to reassert control, defying the federal government. The party has restored its pre-war legislative council and named Debretsion Gebremichael as regional president, creating rival administrations and challenging the Pretoria peace deal that ended the 2020 to 2022 war. Analysts warn that the fragile agreement could unravel, with the EU and Britain calling for restraint. Reports of a fighter jet over Tigray's capital have also added to fears of renewed instability. Our correspondent Tom Canetti has more.
Fears of a renewed conflict in Tigray have reached a new peak this week after a source who I spoke to in Mekelle said that a fighter jet was circling around the region's capital on Tuesday morning On top of that, there was an explosion heard outside the interim president's office on Monday afternoon, which local police reportedly said came from a hand grenade. This all comes after the TPLF, the party who fought the war against the Ethiopian government in 2020, elected a new regional president, which defies Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's extension of the previous one, which he announced in April. It also breaches the Pretoria Agreement, which ended the hostilities between the Ethiopian government and the TPLF in 2022. The TPLF says that it is reinstating its pre-war parliamentary authority, and its new leader, Debretsion Gebremichael, has a more hardliner stance against Addis Ababa. The TPLF has accused the Ethiopian government of implementing a blockade on the region, restricting the flow of humanitarian aid, cash and fuel to Tigray. There have also been clashes in western Tigray where government forces remain and displaced Tigrayans can't return to. Over the last week, both the European Union and the British government have released statements calling for a de-escalation, hoping to prevent another war, as the last one was one of the century's deadliest, killing more than 600,000 people.
In Senegal's coastal city of Mbour, the human cost of irregular migration is being borne by the children left behind. Many are growing up after losing parents who vanished at sea attempting to reach Europe. Aid workers describe it as an invisible grief, a silent trauma families often struggle to acknowledge openly, leaving children unable to fully mourn or find closure. Clarisse Fortuné reports.
Along Senegal's Atlantic coast, the sea is both a lifeline and a source of trauma. In Mbour, traditional fishing boats still launch every day. But for many families here, the ocean also swallowed those who leave hoping to reach Europe. 11-year-old Sokna keeps one of the last gifts her father gave her, a simple shirt. He disappeared at sea after boarding a migrant boat bound for Spain.
I said to him, "Dad, don't go. Don't leave me alone. I only have you and Mom."
The family's hardship deepened after the father's disappearance.
I was thrown out of the room I was living in, with people telling me that the house belongs to my father-in-law and not to my husband. I'm now renting a room, and sometimes I end up with as much as 3 months' rent in arrears without being able to pay, because the little money I earn is barely enough to prepare lunch, and sometimes I can't even manage that.
In Senegal, thousands are believed to have died or disappeared in recent years trying to reach Europe via the dangerous Atlantic migration route. At this support center, orphaned children receive psychological care through games and therapy sessions. Psychotherapist Katie Fay says many children are trapped in uncertainty because families avoid telling them the truth.
I think that in those cases, the children are also in an invisible mourning, because there are many children who think their parents are going to come back one day.
For these children, the migrant crisis is not only measured in lives lost at sea, but also in a silent suffering left behind on shore.
Now to Malawi, where healthcare services heavily dependent on foreign funding are starting to feel severe strain. 1 year after sweeping cuts to US aid programs, NGOs said that they are struggling to cope, warning that a decade of progress in the country's fragile health system could be wiped out. The reductions have left clinics under-resourced and services stretched, raising fears of a full-scale collapse. Luke Schrager has this.
Women line up for care at a clinic in Lilongwe. The Family Planning Association of Malawi has long been a cornerstone for rural care in the East African nation and is often the only medical link for remote areas. But when the United States axed its foreign aid programs a year ago, such services were pared back to the bone, and the NGO struggled to stay on top of health needs.
I know of nearly 25 girls in my village who got pregnant when FPAM suspended its services here last year. Now that they have resumed services, I am sure that cases of early pregnancies will drop, because FPAM provides contraceptives and condoms to young people to ensure that they continue with their education.
It's not just family planning issues either. Beyond an explosion in unplanned pregnancies, More than 1 million of Malawi's 22 million people live with HIV, and the US previously provided 60% of its budget for treating the virus. Cuts were made on such short notice that healthcare providers had nowhere else to turn to make up the shortfall, and thousands of patients facing discrimination where they sought alternatives simply dropped off the medical grid. Facing a loss of a decade's worth of gains in healthcare, associations have appealed not just to the government, but to potential new donors too.
When it comes to budgeting, to consider looking at what gaps have been left by the USAID, the withdrawal of USAID funding, so that that person in the rural area does not get affected, because we know we are likely to lose out on all the successes that we have registered over the years.
Researchers have estimated that globally, cuts to US aid have led to hundreds of thousands of deaths across the world's poorest regions that could have been prevented.
And finally, can a once thriving trade district reinvent itself for a new generation? In Nairobi, the historic area of Ngara, once the heart of the city's Indian textile trade, is experiencing a revival after decades of decline. Aging buildings are being carefully transformed into art spaces, cafes and boutiques. An architectural firm is leading the regeneration, aiming to preserve the area's commercial heritage while introducing a modern cultural identity. This report by Bastien Renouy and Elodie Cousin.
It would have been hard to imagine a trendy bar in this part of Nairobi just a year ago. Located on the edge of the city center, Ngara had a reputation for being unsafe. But in recent months, entrepreneurs have started opening new social spaces here.
When we started, Uber drivers didn't want to come here because it's been a place that people just didn't go to or didn't kind of associate with going to have fun, or you came here for a reason or a purpose, which is a big shame because this is actually a place with such a rich history and so much to offer.
During British colonial rule, Ngara was Nairobi's Indian neighborhood. Over time, as residents moved to more modern areas, shops began to close, Ngara lost its energy. Today, a property developer is buying up these buildings to give them a new purpose.
They were built at a time when they were, robust, voluminous, lots of 3 meter, 4 meter, 5 meter high ceilings, lots of space, lots of light. And you can't see this from here, but in the middle of each of these buildings, there's an atrium which brings a lot of light into the center of the buildings.
Here they are repainting, widening windows, and creating indoor gardens. The aim is to rent out spaces to new businesses while keeping the ones already established.
The investment in the public spaces, the investment from the municipality isn't that strong. And so our job is trying to figure out, can you try and close that gap a little bit by investing both in the private realm, i.e. buying buildings and making them nice, but also putting some of our capital and our time and our resources into the public realm, which means making beautiful spaces that people outside can also use.
When these investors first arrived, some residents were skeptical. But Funsho Alu and his team have managed to win them over.
Whatever they have done a good job. And this will influence and will attract more investors to come. So the history will change.
At a time when many Nairobi neighborhoods are being transformed by new skyscrapers, Ngara's developers have chosen a different path, building on a rich history rather than replacing it.
And speaking of trade, that will be on the agenda as Emmanuel Macron arrives in Kenya this Sunday for a state visit ahead of the Africa-France summit in Nairobi. During his trip, he's also set to meet Kenyan President William Ruto to discuss key bilateral and continental issues. That will be coming up later in the week. For now, there's more news here on France 24.